Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the HVI podcast. And today I'm joined by Dr. Frank Hughes. And today we're discussing his new book titled A Guide to the Gospel of Mark. I'll have the link to purchase the book in the description below and in the pinned comment. I will also have a link to his earlier book that he co-authored with the late Professor Bob Jewett, The Corinthian Correspondence. So if you want to purchase the book I just showed, or the other one, or both, you can do so. That being said, Frank, thank you very much for joining me today.
Well, it's my pleasure. I'm glad to be able to do so. This has been kind of a busy week at the church, and so for the first time, I've been able to stay home all day.
Awesome. So can you tell the audience a little bit about your new book, A Guide to Mark?
Well, yes, it looks like this, and Whip and Stock did a great job with it. I've written two books that are very technical books. My first book was a dissertation directed by Robert Jewett on 2 Thessalonians, and that's a very technical book, and that came out in January of 1989, and then Bob's and my Corinthian book came out in October of 2021. And so, I love writing books like that. But I have felt, and I've discussed this with several other colleagues, I have felt that somehow we have got to communicate what we do in biblical studies and in what is generally called religious studies or theology to a larger audience. In other words, we need to tell other people what we're doing. I think the New Testament is the most interesting set of literature in the history of the world. As a person who has been both a seminary teacher and a college teacher, and also probably more often have been a parish priest, one of the things that I know, and I think every parish priest knows, is that there are people out there who just don't really know much of anything about the Bible. And at least from within the Christian church, you would really want them to know about Jesus and about, what we can know about Jesus from the Gospels. And you would want them to know something about what Paul wrote about salvation, the death and resurrection of Christ, all of those important things. And yet, continuing to just write only at the very scholarly technical level is fine, but it doesn't really help us really do a better job of communicating what biblical studies are really about to a larger audience. And also, as I know from my church, and this is true of other churches as well, we are in the midst of a shortage of clergy. And so when you have a shortage of clergy, one of the things that sometimes happens to churches is that churches are tempted to, shall we say, relax the requirements to make it a little bit easier or a lot easier to get ordained. I'm not accusing any church of doing that, but it's certainly not an unpredicted or unpredictable outcome of when you have a real shortage of clergy. And so I think a lot of churches are going to have a lot of congregations out in the boonies, out in the country, like where I live here. And you're going to have people who, in some cases, are going to be involved in leadership of congregations that, when you just have like one priest or maybe a half a priest or a third of a priest to deal with a congregation, you're not going to spend a lot of time doing the kind of teaching that if you were just, one priest, one congregation, and you would have time to do some of these things. And so I would like to make it easier for people in congregations or having nothing to do with congregations to learn more about documents in the New Testament as well as other parts of the Christian faith. And so I've been talking with acquisitions editors about this for, I suppose, around 10 years or more. And so finally, when I got done with the Corinthian book, which took a whole bunch of time to get done with that, and I essentially had to retire, I began talking again with Michael Thompson at Whip and Stock. And so I wanted to put together a series of books that regular people could actually read and understand. Around 60,000 words in a book. And, books that regular people could really understand. And by regular people, I mean people who are not theologians or professional students or teachers of the Bible, but just, my parishioners and everybody else's parishioners who want to know more about the Bible. And so this book is the first volume of the series. The series is going to be called the Faith and Understanding Series, and it is part of Cascade Books published by Whip and Stock. And so this book came out, it was published on June 13th, yes, a Friday, and it has only 129 pages of text. It does have 10 pages of bibliography plus indices, but it's a book that I think almost anybody, any adult could understand. Plenty of teenagers could understand it. And by using this book, I think, and by reading the Gospel of Mark, you'll be able to really understand the Gospel of Mark. And so, not that this book is the be all and end all of books on Mark, but rather this is a book that should, really open doors for people to learn more about Mark. And so we anticipate having more books in the series. And I'm assuming that the next one that's going to come out is going to be on Matthew. And we have a manuscript to that effect. So we're really looking forward to a good series and a really readable and understandable series.
So how do you intend to guide your readers through the Gospel of Mark? What is your angle on that matter?
Well, actually, I decided that I really had to go. I don't like the term dumb down. I dislike that term very much, but I had to do it in such a way that people could kind of start at square one, maybe not square zero, but square one. And so chapter 1 of this book is called Why and How to Study the Gospels. And I actually begin it with why. Why would you want to study the Gospels? Why would you want to study Mark? What would we think our payoff would be by studying Mark, given that Mark is most likely the first of the Gospels to be written? And then after I deal with why study the Gospels, then most of that chapter is taken up with how. I tell people to actually on page 2 of the book, I tell people they should now read Mark in either 1 or 2 sittings. And you can divide Mark into 2 pieces very easily by stopping at 8:26 and then picking up with 8:27 and going through the end of Mark. But the basic idea is I gave people sort of the historical grounding of, the Synoptic problem, and Mark being the first of the Gospels to be written, and Matthew and Luke using Mark as a written source. And also I talked about the historical Jesus. And before we really got to the Synoptic problem of, which Gospel is first, I actually did kind of go backwards a little bit in scholarship and actually talk about the historical Jesus and what you can know about the historical Jesus, or what we think we can know about the historical Jesus, and how you would sort of find that out. So we really kind of started with the historical Jesus and then looked at the synoptic relationships between Matthew, Mark, and Luke as a kind of a subset of that, with the basic idea is we would like to know what Jesus did and said. And so the question is, how do you find out what it is most likely that Jesus did and said? And the way you find that out is that you try to go back to the earliest sources. And so, I'm, in that sense, I'm very historical and literary, in that we're interested in the earliest sources for Jesus. And I think the earliest source that is a complete source is Mark. But there are some other early sources too. But basically, the basic idea is to go back to the earliest sources, with the idea that the earliest sources are the most reliable sources for learning what Jesus was like, both what Jesus did and what Jesus said.
What convinces you that Mark is the first gospel?
Well, of course, we did a show on this. Well, I think the most important thing is the arguments from order, in that when you look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there are only about 30 verses in Mark that do not find their way also into Matthew and Luke in one way or another. And so there are also slightly over 230 verses that are common to Matthew and Luke that are not in Mark. And those are the verses that, if you believe in the Q hypothesis, you would call those verses Q. And so the basic idea is, when you compare Matthew, Mark, and Luke, if you look at Mark as being first, you compare the Greek of Mark and you compare the Greek with the Greek of Matthew and Luke, you can see that Mark begins with the prophecies seemingly of John the Baptist, and then boom, the baptism of Jesus, and boom, right after that, Jesus' ministry begins. Whereas in Matthew and Luke, you have two different sets of infancy narratives. In other words, you have the annunciation of by the angel Gabriel to the Blessed Virgin Mary in Luke, and then you have the Joseph being communicated with in a dream with God, and so you have a more a traditional biographical thing about, like, where did Jesus come from and what were his parents like, and what do we know about the birth of Jesus. That's a very traditional part of Greek biographies. And so then at the end of the Gospels, the original Gospel of Mark is likely to have ended at 16:8. And it's a real weird ending. The women, they went to the empty tomb, and they're told to go to Galilee, and there they'll see Jesus, but there's no actual appearance of the risen Jesus in 16:1 through 8, the empty tomb story. And they go out from the tomb, and fear and trembling and amazement had taken hold of them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. That's a very strange ending. And of course, the male disciples or apostles are not involved in learning anything about the risen Christ. And that's a humongous omission right there. And so Matthew and Luke add resurrection appearances. And the resurrection appearances are primarily to the apostles, whereas in Mark, the resurrection appearances to the apostles are not there. So basically, when you look at the message of Mark, particularly the message of Mark as it pertains to the apostles, and it's a fairly negative message to the apostles, about the apostles. And then you see how that is, well, rewritten, redacted, edited in Matthew and Luke, especially Matthew, where the apostles take on a much more positive character in Matthew and Luke. And then the apostles have particular resurrection appearances that they experience unlike in Mark, then that leads you to believe that Mark is first, and that Matthew and Luke had a lot of respect for Mark, in that they, for the most part, used Mark as the skeleton of their gospels. But they added stuff at the beginning, they added stuff at the end, and of course, there was a great deal of material added in Luke, from Luke 9:51 until Jesus gets to Jerusalem in chapter 18 of Luke, the travel narrative of Luke. And so Mark was a great book to be the skeleton, and then considerable things were added in by both the author of Matthew and the author of Luke.
When you wrote a guide to Mark, is there anything that occurred to you about the Gospel of Mark that hadn't before?
Yes, the thing that really impressed itself upon me, or that I grabbed hold of intellectually, is, most of my training in graduate school was on Paul and the Pauline corpus. And Paul is very proud of being an apostle. And in Paul and in the book of Acts and in Matthew and in Luke, but especially in Acts and Paul, there's a very strong connection between the resurrection and the message about the resurrection being fundamentally entrusted to the apostles. And the apostoloi are people who are sent. Apostellein means to send. And so people who are apostoloi are people who are sent. And so they are entrusted with the gospel. Paul says in 1 Thessalonians, we were entrusted with the gospel. And so there's this fairly unbreakable connection in Paul's theology, and I would say in Matthew and Luke and Acts, with the message of both the death and especially the resurrection of Jesus, with the office of the apostles. And their office is primarily to tell people that message, preach that message, teach that message, and create local congregations. Apostoloi in the church are traveling church planters and evangelists. And so when you look at that strong connection between the message of the gospel, the message of, what is Jesus, who and what is Jesus and what did he do? And you see that is the major thing that the apostles are trying to communicate to people. And then you see in Mark 16:1 through 8, that there's no connection between the apostles and the message of the gospel. Who are they gonna tell it to? Well, they don't even know. I mean, they don't even see the risen Christ. The apostles in Mark don't even go to the empty tomb, whereas in the other three gospels they do. And so that, to me, is a very distinctive contribution that Mark makes, in that, yes, Jesus died. Yes, Jesus was resurrected. And the early church, both the women who went to the empty tomb and the male apostles who stayed away from the tomb. By the way, the women who went to the empty tomb went to as they thought, anoint the dead body of Jesus. And so when you see that connection between the resurrection and the apostles and the earliest disciples of Jesus is just not there in Mark, it's hard to miss that. It's hard not to see that, as far as I'm concerned.
What do you hope people will gain from your guide to Mark?
Well, as I said, it's got 2 or 3 pages of acknowledgments, and I acknowledge people that I studied with and other Markan scholars that I know, and some commentaries that I think are just fantastic. And then I have 10 pages of bibliography, which is ridiculous. It's a ridiculously long bibliography on Mark. But on the other hand, what I want to do with this book is to open doors for people. I don't really care whether they agree with me, but I would like to kind of open the Gospel of Mark to them and tell them what I see in the Gospel of Mark, and to encourage them to read Mark and then, do that first and then read what I say about each passage, read what I say at the beginning about why and how to study the Gospels. And I think that, when you read Mark and then there are some passages in Mark that are a little bit hard to understand, and I've tried to unpack them as best I could. And so whether they agree with me or not, that's neither here nor there. But I think that I've done a creditable job of opening the Gospel of Mark to them, and to let them see how I see the Gospel of Mark, and also refer to some of the literature, about Mark, and to give them a little taste of what some other scholars say about Mark. And of course, I'm not only giving them a little taste of what others say about Mark, I'm in the process of writing a bigger commentary on Mark as well. And so that's sort of what I'm doing, is writing a bigger commentary on Mark that I would call a medium-sized commentary on Mark. And so what I really want to do is open the Gospel of Mark to people. And with a book of just over 100 pages, I think that this is a book that, people would very likely would very likely read. They'd be more likely to read a 129-page book than they would to read a 500-page book. So that's what I'm trying to do, is to kind of open up Mark to the general reader.
Do you think the Gospel of Mark was familiar in any way with Paul's letters?
I am not convinced that it was. I date Mark somewhere between 65 and 75. And of course, I certainly go with Robert Jewett's. He was a very famous chronologist of Paul. And so he calculated the death of Paul in 62. And of course, you can date the letters of Paul because you can date Paul. And so Paul's authentic letters need to have been written before 62. And he dates the final authentic Pauline letter, Romans, at about 60. And so it's possible that the writer, compiler, editor of Mark might have something to do with, have some familiarity with one or more Pauline letters. But I think there are so many differences between Mark and the authentic letters of Paul that this fundamentally does not seem likely to me. Particularly the differences. Paul is so strong on the connection between the apostles and the risen Christ. Paul is so strong about creating congregations, whereas the Gospels are not about creating congregations. And in addition to the apostles not experiencing the risen Christ in Mark, the apostles only have two difficulties in Mark. They don't agree with Jesus. Peter doesn't agree that Jesus is going to go to Jerusalem and die. And then when Jesus tells them, Peter disagrees with it. And that's when Jesus says to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." So I think that I see the Gospels as being just a completely different body of literature than the earliest body of literature that we have in the New Testament, namely the authentic letters of Paul. So it's possible that there could be some overlap between the letters of Paul and Mark. But on the other hand, how do you tell that? And, when, everybody in the early church didn't read and write. And we also don't know how early the collection of the letters of Paul was. Colossians 4:16 basically documents one might say, the beginning of a Pauline collection by saying, okay, look at the letter that I wrote to the Laodiceans and show them a copy of this letter. So since we don't know how early the letters of Paul were collected, and therefore, you can't collect them until people start copying them. And then you collect them in order to disseminate them. And so we don't have the information that we would like to have on that as far as, before the Gospel of Mark was written. And if you date Mark 65 to 75, Paul has only been dead, for a decade or less, not much more than a decade. And so is there really any evidence that the letters of Paul were being collected and copied as early as the 60s? I'd like to see the evidence, but I don't think there is any.
So, what do you think caused the emergence of the Gospel of Mark? What was the necessity to bring such a gospel out there?
I think this is true of all the Gospels, but I'm believing that Mark is first. Basically, the apostles started dying. If you date the death of Paul in 62, as Robert Jewett does, and then you date the deaths of the other apostles around that same time, that's a very believable date. It's very believable that there was a Neronian persecution and so forth. And so if you date the death of the apostles in the 60s and 70s, okay, Jesus hasn't come back yet. Jesus, in his earthly life, seems to have predicted that he would come back relatively soon. And in the earliest Pauline letter, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 13 through chapter 5, verse 3, Paul talks about what will happen at the second coming. And he includes himself. He talks about those who have died, those who have fallen asleep, meaning died. And then he says they will precede us. And then he speaks, we who are alive, who are left. And so in 4:13 through 5:3 of 1 Thessalonians, Paul includes himself in the people who are going to be alive, as he believes, at the second coming of Jesus. And so that was probably a very common belief that early in the 50s, 60s, etc. As you get later into the first century, for example, by the time of Colossians and especially Ephesians, well, both of them, Colossians and Ephesians, particularly Colossians, seems to have words and phrases that make a lot of sense if the apostle Paul has died. Paul says in Colossians, I make up in my flesh what is lacking in the sufferings of Christ. And so Paul talks about his own suffering, presumably eventually leading towards his death. Of course, in Philippians, you have Paul clearly contemplating his death. Also, that's true in 2 Timothy. So in the later Pauline letters, you have clear evidence that the death of Paul is being contemplated, and may have been, in the case of Colossians and Ephesians, the death of Paul may well have taken place. I think that's also true in 2 Thessalonians. In 2 Thessalonians, it says, don't listen to anybody by a letter as a spirit, or a logos, meaning a teaching, or a letter seeming to be from us, meaning Paul. So that's very unlikely to have been written during Paul's lifetime, but quite likely to have been written after Paul's death. So as you get later into the first century, you're getting a pretty good idea that the apostles are dying or dead. And so when the apostles are dying or dead, that causes a crisis. because at least in Gospels other than Mark, the apostles are seen as the guarantors of what Jesus said and did. If you have some doubts about what Jesus said and did, well, your church was probably founded by an apostle. And when that apostle made the visit to your town and started preaching the death and resurrection of Christ, you could have asked him or her, what, did Jesus really say that? Did Jesus really do that? And they would have been able to tell you. And so when the apostles are no longer alive, including Paul, then there needed to be a body of written literature that would be, it would be there for posterity, so that the next generations, however many that might be, would be able to know what had happened during the lifetime of Jesus, which is exactly what the preface of Luke and the preface of Acts says. The preface of Luke, many have put together narratives of the things that have happened among us. And now, most excellent Theophilus, I am going to do it akribos, meaning accurately. So I think it was really the death of the apostles that was the major impetus for the writing of the Gospels.
So we're going to take a couple of questions from the chat before we close. Let's see. I'm going to scroll up a little bit and see if I'll decide which one I'll pick. Let's start with Zani Abdullah. Hope I pronounced her name correctly. How come a primary source of witness, Matthew, a disciple, copied from a secondary source, Mark, who was not a follower, neither a disciple nor an apostle of Jesus Christ?
Well, how do you know that the Gospel of Matthew is a primary source? How do you know that the Gospel of Matthew came from the Apostle Matthew? Church tradition says it did, but how do you know that? And of course, that gets into the whole issue of how do you know anything about the Gospels? Namely, do you want to rely primarily on the texts of the Gospels themselves? And those are the primary sources, the texts themselves. That's primary. And then when you have early church tradition saying, okay, Matthew was a follower of Jesus, and Matthew is the fellow that wrote the first gospel, and he wrote it originally in Hebrew, yada, yada, yada. That's not primary. The primary source is the written text of Mark. And then when you can show that there's a literary relationship between the Gospel of Matthew and Mark, in that Matthew relied upon Mark as a written source, then it's tradition that says Matthew is an apostle, and Matthew was a hearer of Jesus. And of course, but the question is, can you really substantiate that relationship between the Apostle Matthew and the gospel that goes under that name? And I don't think that there's any good evidence that would allow you to do that.
So the next question I'll take comes from Petros Kyriadikos. In what paper material did Saul Paul was writing so many letters?
Well, Robert Jewett and I certainly have argued that Paul wrote his letters on papyrus rolls. In other words, you would buy a roll of papyrus, and then Paul probably dictated most of his letters, and they were written down on papyrus rolls, and then they were sent to various churches. And so the material that Paul wrote his letters on was papyrus, which papyrus was bought in rolls. And then, of course, if you look in chapter 14 of our Corinthian book, the Corinthian Correspondence, Redaction, Rhetoric, and History, he argues that originally the letters of Paul were written on papyrus rolls. And lots of scholars believe that. That is a common opinion. And then what happened was, in our understanding of the Corinthian correspondence, was that people started reading these letters in different churches, and then apparently there were some people who had some fairly different ideas about Paul and wisdom, and that some Christians had some kind of wisdom that other Christians didn't have, like in 1 Corinthians 1, for example. And so what Bob Jewett argued, and I argued in our Corinthian book, is that the big jump was from the original material was papyrus rolls to the bound book, which is that bound book is what we call a codex. And so, and of course, what really happened is that early Christian churches, basically their work started at the letters of Paul were originally on papyri, and then eventually early Christian churches rejected papyri and then went with the bound book. And of course, the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, was written on scrolls of parchment, but early Christian writings were never generally on scrolls, and the letters of Paul, being shorter, started out on papyrus, bought in rolls, and then later, later after Paul died, probably, then the letters of Paul were edited and collected together, and they became bound books, and that bound book is what we call a codex.
I'll take one more question, and it's going to be from. I realize I slightly mispronounced your last name there, so apologies for that. Petros Kyriakides. Let me take another question from you, and we'll close. So Petros Kyriakides says, and where did he get the materials in prison, supposedly?
Well, in most of his letters that he wrote or dictated, he wasn't in prison. Among the authentic letters of Paul, in the authentic letters of Paul, the one that he was in captivity, of course, was Philippians. In that letter, of course, Paul thanks the Philippians for their apparently financial support of him while he's in custody. So basically, what you tried to do if you were in jail, you tried to have enough money to where you could be in more or less light house arrest, and there had to be lodging for you and also for your jailer. And so among the authentic letters of Paul, the only one that Paul was in jail is Philippians. In 1 Thessalonians, Paul's not in jail, nor Galatians, nor the Corinthian correspondence, nor Romans. Of course, also the other one is that 25 verse letter, the letter to Philemon. That's the only other one. So basically, papyrus, that's what people wrote on. You know, like when I go to Office Depot, I get reams of paper or I get pads of paper, and I shell out money and I write on it. Now and then I write things on the computer. And so what they did was they bought papyrus in rolls. And when Bob was writing his big Romans commentary, which came out in the fall of 2006, he drew on the resources of the Papyrus Institute at the University of Heidelberg. And so if you look at Bob Jewett's big Romans commentary in the Hermeneia series, he talks quite a bit about the use of papyri. And then in chapter 14 of our Corinthian book, he talks quite a bit about the use of papyri as well. Also, a very important book is the book by Harry Gamble of the University of Virginia. And he wrote a book in 1995 that's called Books and Readers in the Early Church.
As a reminder to everybody, the link to purchase A Guide to Mark is in the description below and the pinned comment.
Buy this book.
Indeed. And the link to Frank's previous book, The Corinthian correspondence will also be provided in the description below and the pinned comments. If you want to buy one or the other or get both, you can do that. That being said, Frank, thank you very much for joining me today.
My pleasure.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.